Welcome to the African Diaspora Debate Show, the only multilingual broadcast program focusing on discussing African issues by the African diaspora. I'm George Starr. You are live on Jambo Radio Scotland on FM 87.9 in Glasgow and Renfrewshire, and we are also live on Facebook and YouTube. Since October 2016, a humanitarian and political crisis has embattled the country Cameroon. The mobilization of lawyers, teachers, and students in October 2016, ignored by the government, made way to the revival of identity-based movement, which date back to the 1970s. This movement have been demanding a return to the federal model that existed from 1961 to 1972. Another movement, the Amazonians, says there is no treaty and that exists in the form of a federal Cameroon, so they are not part of Cameroon configuration. In this triangular conundrum, we now have the government of Cameroon on the one hand, those who demand for return to the federal model on the other hand, and those advocating that the English-speaking people, or Anglophones as it is known, are not part of Cameroon, but Amazonia on another hand. The focus of this discussion is the territory of Cameroon, and we are asking, is Cameroon in denial of its own history? Send us your comments, questions in the comment section on our Facebook page and YouTube channel, and you can also text studio via WhatsApp on 0745 9906822 if you are in the UK. And if you are following the conversation from outside the UK, you can add +44 before the number if you want to text or send a WhatsApp message. Before we begin this discussion, we want to extend our condolences to the bereaved families of the victims of the killings in the school in Kumba in Cameroon. To prepare for this edition of the program or the African Diaspora Debate Show, we invited over 6 different factions with connections to this subject, but only one was able to garner the courage and accept our invitation. I'm glad to see we are now joined by Professor Ben Aki, leader of English Cameroon for a United Cameroon. Professor Ben Aki, thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon and joining us on Jambo Radio. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your invitation. Thank you for taking an interest in Cameroon, because this is a crisis that is neglected by many Africans. And thank you also for your community radio, which is doing a lot just to go beyond the rhetoric and actually present material, because if Africans are to be engaged in the affairs of other Africans at home and in the diaspora, that has to be on the basis of information, because information is the key through which things are manipulated. And if you only see the surface, you will never really get to understand the issues that are at stake and what is it that connects us and what we can do to improve our community and the connection among its people.
We appreciate that, sir. I'll just remind our listeners again that you're listening to our conversation on Cameroon, and this topic is about if Cameroon is in denial of its history, its own history. So we are joined by, again, Professor Ben Aki, who is in the United States, and we're glad to have been joined by him this afternoon. Prof, before we get into the main question, let me ask you this. You recently posted on your Facebook page, United Cameroon must be free from beer and amber, and West Cameroon will not be Eritrea. What do you mean by that, sir?
Thank you for your attention on the material we post. We consider I am from the movement for a free Cameroon that started in the 1950s and was brutally repressed. This is my historical connection, and we consider that Mr. Biya is a representative of the colonial system that denied us true independence, and he continues to manifest that today. So true liberation of a united Cameroon will begin when this government is replaced by a government that is actually chosen by the people of Cameroon, because so far the people of Cameroon have never really had a say in the choice of their leaders. Then the other case, I said, must be free from Ambazonia, because Ambazonia is a separatist movement which cannot succeed even after decades of war, separatist war. They cannot win that war, and we don't see how they can achieve their separation. But in the meantime, they have decided to oppress our people through many atrocious acts, kidnapping, torture, and extortion. So we are longing for freedom in that sense. What I also mean is that even if something was to happen, such as a protracted war, a separatist war of 20 years, which leads to death of millions of West Cameroonians, the international community may be wrongly compelled to pressure for a referendum on separation. But if that separation were ever to become actual, I do not see any future for West Cameroon that is different from the future that has come to the people of Eritrea. They fought for separation from Ethiopia, and when they got the separation, up to now, they are under a dictatorship where they are not able to choose their leader, where they don't have freedom, and where up to about 27% of the population has to go through military service. So it is really... I think that if you ask the people of Eritrea, they would think that they had relatively more freedom in a united Eritrea and Ethiopia. So what we are saying is that learning from these examples in the continent, we must do everything to prevent the lies of Ambazonia in protracting the war. And tomorrow we must also inform the international community well enough to understand that what Ambazonia is seeking is a tyranny, which we already see expressed in the no-school policy, which they imposed on the people, ghost town they imposed on the people, and levies or demands for them to contribute for the war, expressed in the form of torture and kidnappings. So we already see signs of a repressive society, whereas West Cameroon is that part of Cameroon which has always believed in freedom. And one good example is shown by a show now. You invited us with different perspective to come and be engaged in a dialectic on the problem. Where are we going, and what is the pragmatic and legal thing to do? The other sides have not shown up because they believe in the monopolization of a narrative, and that narrative should not be checked by counter arguments. And so we are drifting in the direction of Eritrea. And that's what I'm saying, that as long as our platform is there engaged, we will fight to reveal to the people the danger ahead, and also reveal to the people the path which will lead to a free Cameroon.
Yes, just for the benefit of our listeners, Professor, what is United Cameroon and what is West Cameroon in the explanation that you just gave?
United Cameroon refers to the reunion of West Cameroon and East Cameroon. East Cameroon formerly being a trust territory under French control, a UN trust territory under French control, and West Cameroon being part of British Cameroon. British Cameroon was formerly divided into Northern Cameroon and Southern Cameroon. And when plebiscite in 1961 decided the question where they should go in order to obtain their freedom from this trusteeship arrangement, the British Northern Cameroons decided to join Nigeria, and British Southern Cameroons joined Cameroon. And being located west of the country, it was then no longer reasonable to call it British Southern Cameroon, because there is a southern part of Cameroon which does not correspond to that part we are talking about. And geographically, it was then logical from 1961 after reunification to call the part which was formerly British Southern Cameroons as West Cameroon. And therefore, from our perspective, advocating and recognizing the unity of the former UN trust territory under France and the former British trust territory under Britain, recognizing that as United Cameroon and the former Southern Cameroon, former British Southern Cameroons, we refer that to West Cameroon. So just by using the name West Cameroon, inherent in that is a commitment to the unity of the country and the recognition that the name Southern Cameroon is a historical name. It is no longer an actual name of an entity. When it is expressed that way, it is inherently expressing a separatist tendency, which we refute, of course.
Do people from Cameroon have a common history, Professor?
Once more, I'm sorry.
Do people in Cameroon from Cameroon have a common history? Is there a common history in Cameroon among all Cameroonians that they believe this is history?
There's a common history, and let us first of all recognize that the boundaries of Europe have been changing over the last 1,000 years, and there are parts of Germany which have been German, and sometimes they're France, sometimes they're German, and some end up being part of Belgium. So that is the history of the world. That's the general principle, which is operative in Europe and operative in Cameroon. But we do have a general history, which starts with an area which was called Cameroon's River. If you go into the archives of the UK, you will find more correspondence and references to the name Cameroon's River. And the way to understand this is to go back to missionary activities in Cameroon that started in 1840. So when the first schools were created by the Baptist missionary, and it lasted for a long time until the annexation of that part of the country by a German company, which then became part of Germany in 1884. So there is a common history. If you start just by looking at the part which is close to this area, which was called Cameroon's River, on the French speaking side, you have Douala, and on the English-speaking side, for example, you have Victoria, what was called Victoria and today is called Limbe. You have Limbe. So you have Limbe, you have Bimbia and other areas. So this area around the Cameroon's River, which today happens to be on both sides of the language divide, they have always considered themselves to be part of the same country. Now, the expansion of that area into a greater Cameroon was the result of progressive missionary activities and also very rapid expansion when the Germans came in 1884. Because what we would understand there is that the northern part of Cameroon was a part of the Sokoto Caliphate, which lasted from about the beginning of the 19th century to when the Germans took that part of the Sokoto Caliphate and formed into Cameroon just about the same time that the British were fighting a war in the north of Nigeria to eventually bring northern Nigeria under the control of the British Empire in 1903. So it's not a very distant event. So 1903, northern Nigeria, then part of Sokoto Caliphate, officially became a colony of Britain, and that's how the nation of Nigeria is crafted. So if you look at the history of Nigeria, there's some similarities. There are some issues that link over. So there is indeed a united Cameroon, which is created using the political mechanisms that we find in history, that a greater power can come in and enforce authority, and that authority can create some expansion, and from there, common history begins to emerge. But we are not only looking at that. I am from the northwest region of Cameroon, and if I trace my cultural history, I am from the Tikari people, the Tikals. And the Tikals, by that time, they were displaced around the 19th century, beginning of the 19th century, when the Sokoto Caliphate was formed. Not many of them were Muslims, and many of them were farmers, whereas most of the new immigrants into northern Cameroon, they were herdsmen. So much of that population was displaced towards the south. And therefore, many of the people you find in northwest region of Cameroon are people who were originally in the Adamawa area, which is in French part of Cameroon. So this migration pattern and mixing tells you that if we can accept that initial Cameroon that expanded, that had first of all Douala, Limbe, and Victoria, and then expanded up to the Bamum, the Bamileke, and then to the rest of the grass field. It captures the mixing of a group of immigrants who form what we call Cameroon today. My tribe, my village from which I come in the northwest region is not older than 250 years, and so my great grandparents never arrived that part of the country. They were in Adamawa region. So it gives you a unique appreciation of the idea that there is indeed a country called Cameroon that is born out of colonial activities, but also migration patterns. And in addition to these migration patterns, the propagation of the gospel that was brought to the coast of Cameroon in 1844, first by the Baptist missionary. And it would interest you to know that the founder of Christianity in Cameroon is an Afro-Jamaican. So Joseph Merrick, these were Baptists because the Baptists played a significant role in the ending of slavery in Jamaica. And that Baptist church, which was formed, was then able to use many of the Afro-Jamaicans as missionaries in Africa. And so Joseph Merrick was among the first who opened a school in Cameroon, and then Joseph Jackson Fuller followed from there, and he was really the one who was in control of the Protestant missionary activities before the Germans took over in 1884. So there is a history there that is connected to the greater African diaspora that we need to understand. And when they came in, they used the Protestant idea of elevating the cultures where you go and then helping them to go towards independence. So what they did at that time was to translate the Bible into languages like Bimbia and Douala. And when the English Alfred Secker came, they expanded that kind of activity. And so with the Douala language now, you had more missionaries who expanded. So if you go into West Cameroon today, you go to churches that have nothing to do with Douala, but they sing in Douala because this is the historical mechanism by which the gospel was spread around there. And they'll have songs which are composed in Douala, and then they sing that, sharing a kind of culture. So it's an interesting mix that would be lost in dwelling on the later part of the colonial period. Because if you take the British presence through the missionary activity from 1844, and then you add the German presence from 1884 to about the end of the First World War, you see that that is a longer period of time compared to the Trust Territory period that lasted from about 1917, 1918 to the 1960. So that period of time where the country was divided into France and English, you find that overwhelmingly, even in the Douala area, the reunification fathers of the country, they came from the Douala area. This shows that there was already a significant English presence in Douala. If you want to read the language of the Doualas and you approach that from the French, your pronunciation will be very awful. But if you approach it as an English-speaking person, you'll be able to read intelligibly and people would understand you. So in the area of Littora, you have a kind of memory of a time when the predominant cultures were influenced by the English and the British, so English and the Germans. So there's a kind of coming back to history in that.
Yeah, Prof, I think we're losing you somehow, but I'll just crack on. Well, from what you've just described there and narrated there, it sounds, Cameroon is a very diverse country in terms of its history and cultural heritage. Why are people in Cameroon so confused about this? Or do you think it's systematically it's not there's a system in place has not perhaps mobilized this diversity to benefit the cultural heritage and historical heritage of Cameroon?
I think the mistake started in the 1950s and with some of the colonial. Really, we have never been a colony. Cameroon has not been a colony in the technical sense of it. We were German when the Germans annexed Cameroon was like a protected area, but as the UN and League of Nations, we were trust territories. But the French decided to treat Cameroon as a colony, and they decided to deny Cameroon the path to true independence. And in order to achieve that, it was important to control the history, to control the cultural history of the place. And I would like to attribute my clarity in my activism to my faith, because I'm a Protestant, and therefore I am aware of the Protestant cultural history of the country, which goes much further than most people know. So I am aware of this, and I'm ashamed that most of our people do not know that history, and they do not really try to dig into that history to understand. So what I do understand from there, that even by the time that the Germans came to annex Cameroon, when they annexed Cameroon in 1884.
Yes, Prof, I was just going to ask you, when you say the people are not aware of this history, is that a systematic failure by the people that are running Cameroon to have educated the population on this history?
It's a failure. It's a conscious failure. It's a failure which results from a conscious action. Once you try to,
you mean by that?
Once you try to deny the truth, then you begin to operate outside truth. But nature is such that it will always bring this back to you. So I was just going to indicate to you that there has always been a sense of independence in Cameroon that begins with the Baptist missionaries who did not come to establish a church that is controlled from Europe. Their idea was to empower the people and let them continue the expansion of the gospel and run their churches. One of the principles was that the churches were not to be run with money from Europe. So if they needed to pay teachers, they needed to raise the money from there. So people will bring food from the farm, they will bring all of this to the church, and they will sell, they try to raise money from there. So from the very beginning, from the 1840s, the doctrine has been to raise the Cameroonians to be independent. That is why in 1884, when Cameroon was annexed, and then when the Baptist missionaries left and handed over to missionary societies from Germany, part of the church refused to come under any control of a European church. That is the Native Baptist Church in Douala. So they thought that they were already sufficiently independent to handle their religious affairs without interference by any European power. And that movement continued into the 1920s with the father of the famous musician from Cameroon, Eboalotin, the late Eboalotin. The father of Eboalotin was kind of a nationalist, a believer in this idea that Cameroon should be free from European control, even in the 1920s. And he had to sit in prison for a kind of nationalistic spirit that he was raising. He was bringing to the forefront. So he created this movement in Douala where the people were very conscious that we are independent and we ought to be running our affairs ourselves. And it is out of that that the UPC, when it started in 1948, the colonial powers, the French colonial powers, were surprised how a small movement could start in 1948, and by 1952 it had covered the whole territory. The people had become so aware, so politically mature that they wanted to reunify with the British Cameroon, and they were asking for immediate independence. So it took the French powers by surprise. And what they needed to do then was to try to overcome this. So Cameroon is a country which unfortunately is built on many, many, many mistakes from this time after the formation of the UPC. Because what you find is the party could not win election. Even Ruben Umnyobe, who is technically the father of the nation, he stood election in 1952 in his own Sanaga Maritime. His victory could never be doubted. But when the results came out, they had falsified the result, and then they gave the victory to a certain Catholic Abbé, because you find then the Catholic Church came into Cameroon in 1890. First of all, because von Bismarck, he was a Protestant leader in Germany. So there was a little bit of resistance to allow Catholics from any nation that is not German speaking. And so the first Catholics could only come from a German speaking country in order to kind of compensate for that and still allow for religious diversity. So the Catholic Church comes into to Cameroon 1890. But when the First World War ends, you now have the Catholic Church taken over by the French on the French side, and then by the Holy Spirit Fathers on Holy Ghost Fathers on the English side. So then you begin to see a dynamic where the church is going along with the colonial masters, something which was absent even in the time of the British, because the British were present mostly through traders and missionaries, not through the official government. They pleaded with the government to annex Cameroon, and I think that's also part of the history of Cameroon, that when the authority was eventually given, they arrived 2 days too late when the Germans had already annexed Cameroon. So there are some mistakes going on there. But the point is that starting from the 1948, when the UPC appears as the spokespeople of the people of Cameroon, asserting reunification, asserting independence, this was contrary to the French plan for what was going to be a perpetual colony, because this was the philosophy of Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle did not have any intention to make the colonies in Africa independent ever. He is on record making that statement, that we were asked to invest in our colonies, and we have invested in our colonies. We have no intention to give them up anytime soon. So this was contrary. First asking for reunification and asking for true independence was against the will of the French colonial powers. And so the victory of Ruben Umnyobe was the beginning of the repression of that power, of that party. So the party was then later on proscribed after the 92 fiasco. It became clear to them that they cannot use legal means to achieve what they were looking for, because they were repressed, they were scattered whenever they met. And then 1955, the party was banned in Cameroon. This was a way to give room now to parties which had no true representation among the people to speak for the people of Cameroon. That is where you start seeing the history of the country purposefully twisted. So it begins from there. You can see that there is a conscious effort, and if there is West Cameroon today in Cameroon, it is because there was a French socialist who was sent to Cameroon as a governor in 1958. He came in February 1958. He left in March. He was in Cameroon for 3 weeks. That is the shortest possible colonial governorship in the history of Cameroon. But this socialist understood more than anybody what the UPC was up to. He understood that these people speak the language of the people, and therefore the only way to defeat them is to flip the political agenda. So you suck out the oxygen from what is animating them and say, what do they want? They want reunification. Okay, our official policy will move from the predominantly Catholic resistance to reunification. It will move towards saying we should reunite with the British Cameroon. And then we will say, instead of delaying the independence, as most of the politicians who were mostly from the Catholic faith, they were advocating for a later independence. We will speed up the independence. We will give you independence within a very short time. So this was in 1958, and independence came in 1962. So once he flipped the card on the UPC, then it became clearer that the history has to be manipulated continuously from here in such a way that we deny the true history of what UPC stood for. So the reunification that was embraced in order to weaken the resistance of the UPC in the French territory. So
Prof, would you say in the middle of this confusion of the history of Cameroon, the confusion that started back from what you're saying, in the missionaries and the church, and also the French that you've brought in there, and the British, of course, is that confusion that continues to be Cameroon's problem today?
Yes, that confusion continues today to be the issue, and then it is also made worse by another factor which we have not considered, because despite the interference of the French, if selfishness had not entered the political scene of Cameroon, on the French side, on the English-speaking side, the people would still have been able to unite and find their way. But you can also add to the confusion imposed by the French colonial machine, the churches with their own ideologies. You can add to this the selfishness of the political leaders of the 1960s and 1970s and so on. Because their calculus was mostly driven by personal interest and sometimes influenced by the churches to which they belong. There is a very clear demonstration of this that we can find, for example, in the politics of John Foncha, because what we need to appreciate is that almost all the political parties in British Southern Cameroons at that time, they were created with the help of people from French Cameroon. If we take the KNC of Indele, for instance, the KNC of Indele was formed by fusing Indele's party, which had, I think it was NC related, ANC or something of that sort, but it was fused with KUNC, which you can immediately see the influence of that KUNC on the name that eventually came out. And that was a party formed by Robert Jabiakum Dibonge. Dibonge was from Akwa, and he was one of the highest placed officers, Cameroonian officers in the German government at the end of the war. So he relocated to the British side of the country and was a voice animating the spirit for reunification. And then when you come to the party of Foncha, John Foncha, the KNDP was technically formed by the UPC, which had been aligned with KNC, when Indele changed his mind about reunification. So the UPC, which was then present in British Cameroon and animating this spirit of reunification and independence, they fought to find alternatives to Indele's KNC. And Foncha was a member of Indele's KNC. So the UPC technically formed the party KNDP and brought in Foncha as a leader and brought in the person whom I follow, Ntumaza. So he joined them as well. So it was technically KNDP UPC. But the colonial system in East Cameroon had aligned with the church, first to say that UPC was a communist party and the church should officially be against communists because they are not Christians and so on, and they are violent people. So then that extended to British Southern Cameroons, where Foncha, being a devout Catholic, was warned to dissociate himself from the communist UPC. And that is when KNDP began to fight a confused politics. It was not clear whether they were against integration with Nigeria whether they were for association with East Cameroon, they began to animate what was then considered an independent stream. They wanted to leave Nigeria and form an independent country. So a lot of this confusion that goes on, especially among West Cameroonians today, can be traced to the politics of Foncha. And in the politics of Foncha, you find personal interest, church censorship, and then some kind of original connection to UPC coming into play. That is the time when our mentor in history, Ntumaza, he broke away and formed one Cameroon, which was technically UPC in British Cameroon, but it did not have as much traction. What helped the history in the 1950s leading up to independence and reunification, it was the technical alignment of the UPC militants in the East and in the West, because they understood the dynamics within the continent at that time. Let me illustrate. Pan-Africanism can be divided into three streams. There are the African diaspora who seek to connect their values to values that come from Africa. They make no distinction to country you come from, as far as you're from the mother continent, and then you have something to offer. They want to learn something from you.
That's right.
So that's a kind of positive feeling inspired solidarity movement.
Which is why
within Africa.
Yeah, which is why I was just going to put in there for the benefit of our listeners, which is why there's a huge movement in Africa now, or by African government, basically, of goodwill to, perhaps, not even perhaps, but they're actually giving African Americans nationalities in Africa so that they can regain their class as part of the African diaspora. Prof, continue. But before you continue, Prof, I was going to ask, from what you're narrating here, there is, obviously, a lot of confusion, and you've stated that very clearly earlier in your narratives that you're bringing up there. I was going to ask you, is because of that confusion we started then, and the current confusions that are in Cameroon, how do you clear up that confusion? What would you say?
So if you see that the confusion is organized from the top, then you start from the top. And that means if the political leadership of the country is rooted in an error, is rooted in a deceptive mechanism, then you have to start somewhere from there. And that is why our activism is to articulate the need for all Cameroonians to tell Mr. Biya, who has been in power for 38 years, to resign, because he was really never chosen by the people in an explicit electoral process. And what he has done, he has sustained his stay in power by manipulating the constitution and by rigging elections, right? So you see that when the lie is nationalized at that level, it is difficult for you to solve the problem starting from the bottom. What you can do from the bottom is to organize the people around an idea, and that idea should force change to come from the top. Because what you need is, you need a well, I don't want to use charismatic as the criterion for that. You need a leader with a clear vision for reforms, to set Cameroon on the path of a true constitutional democracy. What you need is a true constitutional democracy and freedom of expression, freedom of press, so that people can eventually find out what their history is.
Yes, if Cameroon is configured in such a confusion, Prof, I'm going to ask you, if Cameroon has the genesis of Cameroon, the entity Cameroon is, born out of this massive confusion from your narrative there and the historical facts that you're pointing out there. Do you think that there is a way that can be changed at the top? Because it looks like most of the people that are at the top of Cameroon are aware of this confusion, and they continue to use that confusion to manipulate the population. So, and that brings in the issue of separation.
I think separation plays into the hands of the people at the top, so it actually works in their favor. I'll give you an example. For all its own faults and weaknesses, you can still give credit to SDF, which, for the record, it has been indicated that the SDF was formed with the influence of our father and the Ntumaza of one Cameroon, whose idea has always been to support the unity of the two Cameroons and deny the continuation of French neocolonialism in Cameroon. So SDF is part of that legacy, and so for all their failures, they gave the semblance of a voice for the people. And what has happened, but because of embracing this separatism in West Cameroon, the SDF has been demolished in West Cameroon, and the party in power, which is the repressive mechanism, now has complete control of the country. It has complete control of the parliament, complete control of the councils and things like that. So it shows very clearly that when you take a short-sighted view that the solution to the problem is separation, what you end up doing is actually strengthening that oppressive mechanism that has been put in place, because the government will always tell you we are following the rule of law, we have a constitution, we are doing all of this, but they are all lies, and everybody knows that there's a lie. But the international community cannot come in and impose themselves on that. It's only the people of Cameroon who can organize. And the only way to overcome such a tyranny in a country is to follow what British thinker Thomas Hobbes says, that no matter how big a giant is, we can overcome that giant by uniting our feeble means. So if we come together, then we can do that. So the government knows that unity around an idea is the problem that will bring them down, is the force that will bring them down. And so they have to continue animating that. The only unfortunate situation for them is that we now live in an environment where there is free exchange of information. With the limited impact that our platform has, it has awakened many Cameroonians to understand the history and to understand what is at stake. It is really through that process now that you see that the government can no longer control the narrative in the way it has always done in the past. So that is creating some kind of hope. So the solution cannot be any part of the country breaking away from the United Cameroon, because when they do that, they are actually along the lines of what the government has done, because what the government was able to do was to gradually, first of all, repress, kill the leaders of the UPC, and the UPC that was left over was that now broken down by co-opting these people into the government in power, and only in Ntumaza, in my appraisal, and the Ntumaza is the only UPC who managed to the end to at least transmit this idea to another party, SDF, while still remaining true to the spirit of the initial UPC. So that's what we are seeing, that the solution, whoever articulates the solution of Cameroon as separation, for example, in the case of West Cameroon, the thing, first of all, is that the historical basis for it are very shaky, because the geography and some of the cultural history, it's complicated. The religious dimension I've just explained to you is not understood by the people, so that you end up seeing, even in West Cameroon today, people who are arguing about the grass field versus the people from the Southwest. They say that they don't like the dominance of the people from the Northwest.
Northwest and Southwest, yes.
So the Northwest and Southwest, people misinterpret what happened with Foncha and his subsequent government. For instance, when Foncha, initially vice president and also prime minister of West Cameroon, when he had to respect the constitution that said you cannot be vice president and keeping the two posts, an exception was made for him in the first term. In the second term, that separation needed to be respected, and he was going to move to Yaoundé to become vice president, and a different person was going to take over the prime ministership of West Cameroon. So Muna was the closest to taking over, but for all his faults, he was closer to the French colonial system. The church, the Catholic Church, said, no, we don't want a Protestant. Please try to make sure that it does not go to a Protestant.
Right.
And it is one of the cases where a mistake turns out to be good for the people, because Augustin Ngomjoa, who was Catholic from Com, became the prime minister. But this is the closest politician in West Cameroon that I can respect to be standing up for the people, even though he was choosing a process that was directed by the church. He was from the Northwest. So when you look at the election of 1959, then this idea of Northwest-Southwest division does not make sense, because my grandfather, as a Protestant from the Menchum area, he was supporting Indele, because Indele was the most prominent Protestant leading the people, and they listened to him. So a good section of the people in Menchum supported KNC, and they would have joined Nigeria, according to Indele. And now some people say Indele's idea to join Nigeria was influenced because his wife was Nigerian. And that would mean that it is not the interest of the people that was at the forefront. People have argued that if Indele had led the reunification with Cameroon, things would have ended up better. And still, to look at that election of 1959, if you go to Northwest, you will look at the way people voted. You go to Nkambe, for example. Nkambe, predominantly Protestant with the Baptist, they voted very strongly for Indele. Indele was the favorite candidate in Nkambe. And so the victory of Foncha by 2 votes really came, by 2 seats, really came from the Com, which is closer to Catholic, switching their allegiance from Indele towards Foncha. So the history is very tortuous.
So yeah, as I think our viewers and listeners can also work out that it is really complex, the way Cameroon is formed, and the way and that can reflect in the current situations that is in Cameroon. So Ambazonia comes into that confusion. Is that where do you think, you've mentioned West Cameroon? For people that don't know, Cameroon was 2 parts, and the West Cameroon is a former, is a part of Cameroon that are of English-speaking heritage, and they basically were run by the British administration during the colonial time, we can say, and also the French Cameroon, the French-speaking part of Cameroon, was run by the French, and obviously, as he says, but with this confusion that you saying there, Prof, my question is, where is the stance of Southern Cameroonians, Ambazonians, West Cameroonians, all this sort of confusion? Are they helping the confusion, or are they looking for a solution out of that confusion?
I think Ambazonia is a mistake rooted in a misunderstanding of the general principles of secession. It starts from the 1990s. There was a Cameroon Anglophone movement which was advocating for ending the marginalization of Anglophones in Cameroon. And then Frundi wins the election in 1992 to become president, and he's denied that. There is evidence to that effect.
Was it? You've mentioned when the leadership, the choice of leadership that is in Cameroon. It looks like the church, or the Catholic Church, we can say, has played a huge part as well in influences those decisions. We can also say, well, if history, some of this information are true, the current president of Cameroon is Catholic, so the Catholic Church basically influencing Cameroon leadership.
That is very true. I am not committed to the tribal narrative that is used to justify this, because most people will say Cameroon is run by Beti Bolo and all of that. What they mean by that is that when in 1890 the Palatine missionaries, the Catholic missionaries, came to the Douala area, Douala was already very Protestant, and so animosities that came from the Reformation also transferred to Cameroon very rapidly, and so they were not very much welcome in that area. They had to move a little bit further from Douala, and so they ended up having their stronghold in what you have today, the Center-South region. So the Center-South region corresponds to the stronghold of the Catholic Church in French Cameroon. So when you look at Mr. Biya's government, he's a former seminarian. He's a former Catholic seminarian. And if you look at his government, you look at the way he formulates it, he keeps an eye on the religious affiliation of the people who are closest to him. And I think that that's a more predictive classification of power structure in Cameroon. They will not like to admit that. I prefer to talk about the religious forces because they are more motivational than the tribal power fight that you have there. But I've always believed that the history of Cameroon is distorted by that. But to come back to the idea of where does Ambazonia come from?
Would you, Prof, sorry, I'll just ask you in this. Would you point a finger to the Catholic Church for bringing the confusion or putting the confusion that is there? Because Christian Cardinal Toomey is absolutely a powerful figure in Cameroon as well. So you could say, would you point a finger to the church?
I think Christian Cardinal Toomey, he's in a difficult situation because the people in the East are his brothers, right? Most of the people in power are his brothers, and they have not understood.
Based on their affiliation to the church?
Well, his affiliation to the church, but he's from the English-speaking part. He cannot have as much of an overriding rule as the predominantly center-south location of Catholic power in Cameroon. But now let me put the argument clearly.
Yes.
The politics of French Africa, the politics was really guided by a conservative Catholic movement in France. Now, when you come to the concrete case of Cameroon, there was a bishop in Yaoundé who was called René Graffin. René Graffin, he was of the view that Cameroon cannot become independent. And he was also one of the few Catholic fathers who instituted a separation even within the church. The whites could not sit on the same side with the Cameroonians. And he was the staunchest opponent to the UPC. He sent out an official letter, no Catholic should become a member of the UPC. So when you look at the list of the UPC, you look at most of the people who were massacred in Cameroon for fighting for independence, you see that it's disproportionately non-Christian or it's Protestant. So that dynamic is there. And it's because of this bishop, and Ruben Umnyobe responded to his letter. There was an open letter, and there is a reason why loses his election in 1952 to a Catholic abbé in a rigged manner, right? So you can see the power. And then the person who is mentoring most of these politicians was Louis-Paul Ojula. Louis-Paul Ojula came to Cameroon as a missionary. So he was inspired by Albert Schweitzer, the Protestant in Gabon, to also do a similar thing in Cameroon. But when he came, it was the clear understanding that Cameroon has been dominated by the Protestant. We need to do something to change that. And so he formed this center at Luchem through health services, reaching out and getting more Cameroonians involved in the Catholic Church. So that is basically the picture that you have that is going on in that situation. And then look at the person who engineers the whole colonial picture of Cameroon. It's the person who engineers. I hope I'm back on.
Yeah, I can hear you. Prof. Yeah, carry on.
So the person who controls the colonial politics of France is really Jacques Foccart. right?
Okay.
Jacques Foucault, again, is coming out of the church tradition, a very conservative Catholic in that sense. So the signature of the church is there. And when André Marie Mbida, the first prime minister, himself a former seminarian, he was strongly against reunification of British Cameroon with the French Cameroon.
Prof, should Cameroonian be pointing the finger to the Vatican of this confusion that they put in Cameroon? Because Ambazonia or Southern Cameroon or West Cameroon, ideas cannot solve the problem from what you're explaining. Would that be
Yes. It's complicated because I think the Vatican is aware of some of this, because the Vatican began taking a little bit of a distance from what Ojula was doing.
So the population of Cameroon is misinformed, is misguided by all the different factions of the political ideologies that people are bringing in and confusing the population. Meanwhile, the real problem is the church.
Exactly. They will not admit to that. They will say we have no power, we have no direct connection. But this is what is dominating the politics in France. If you look at the collapse of the Third French Republic, you will discover that it was really the fight between the left and then the conservative Catholic right, which brought about the collapse of the Third French Republic. And these forces are there. So it is rather through France, which has always had a kind of it in public. It is a separation of church and state. But the way the state is run, it's in a way that it has to conform to its identity as a Catholic nation. And so these things influence most of the people who rise to power are people who also have some conservative religious connections. So I think the way to solve it, one of my recommendations has been that the Catholic leadership needs to play a pastoral role to advise Mr. Biya to step down.
Okay.
That can be done behind the scene. The Pope can do that. The bishops can do that because he is a devout Catholic. And therefore, the church can tell him where the country is. You don't have the resources to solve these problems. You can generate a positive momentum to resolve the many crises in the country by simply tendering your resignation. And we follow the Constitution to elect the next president.
You're bringing in a very interesting point there, which I've not heard since I've been following the politics and the history of Cameroon, which is basically the reason why we wanted to have this conversation on, if Cameroon is in denial of its own history. Now, these are facts, from what you're saying, and they are available for Cameroonians to...
Yes, they can verify that. They can verify that. It is true that history is interpretive. History is interpretive, but you have to apply different interpretations and then see which one connects most of the facts. And if you apply the lens of religion, you will see that it is a very, very explanatory framework that helps you to understand Cameroon as it is today.
Absolutely. So should people from Cameroon be protesting for the Vatican to take control and take complete leadership and then disconnect from the system? You're asking for Mr. Biya for the Vatican to be able to tell Mr. Biya to resign. So what you're saying, from what you're saying, Prof, so should Cameroonian or people from Cameroon, wherever, what Ambazonia, English speaking or French speaking, should not be affiliating to politics, but should stand up against the church influence on the politics in Cameroon?
I think the way it is set up is that formally, the Catholics are very intelligent people. They're very rationalistic, but they know also how to play power. They will tell you there's no formal link. We can apologize for what our bishop did in the 1950s, but today we have no link to the power. Yes, the people in power may be our Christians, but we don't have any link to that. That would be what they will say officially, and they will have reasons to say so. But I would deny that. And I will also have reasons to say so. But I think the most important part is to say that as a church, it is your place to be a witness to the truth, to be a witness to justice, to recognize that the problems of Cameroon comes down to two things: manipulation of the constitution and rigging of elections. So if these two things were corrected,
that did not start with Mr. Biya.
No, he's a product of the system. Because let me show you what happens. Mr. Biya is a student in France, disconnected from most of the politics. When he finishes, he is coming back to Cameroon, and he gets a letter of recommendation from Louis-Paul Ojola, this Catholic missionary who was responsible for the choice of Ahidjo to get into politics. The records are there that the first election that Mr. Ahidjo ever stood, he was not a politician. The idea of Ahidjo coming into politics was tactical. Ahidjo is from the north. The north was completely disconnected from this political fight, which can boil down to Catholic Protestant in the south.
Okay, I'm informed that we're running out of time, so I'm just going to go. I want to kind of hear. You've made some suggestions, as well as breaking down the history, and I'm really grateful for that. As breaking down the confusion, the history, and all those things that are linked together. And you've also made proposition. Is your only solution for Cameroon that Mr. Biya should resign?
There are two possible things. They could find a temporary solution to the West Cameroon problem by reverting to the federation. I doubt that Mr. Biya will ever do that. So if he call for
that'll be two-state federation, you mean?
Yeah, I think that's the argument now people are saying. But he's going to use the Southwest to oppose any reunification with the Northwest. So. So I don't, even if it came down to that, Mr. Biya is going to use the Southwest to oppose the Northwest as a solution to that. But that's the most significant change that can oppose the separatists, because most of the separatists are kind of split in two. Some of them came into the separatist stream in the hope of using that to get to federation. But it is a wrong strategy because it fails to understand the theory of secession. You cannot use secession to get political concessions, because once the state understands that you have declared war or secession, they are covered in fighting you. The international community can only blame them for war crimes. And these war crimes are never really characterized as war crimes, because they can say people were killed in self-defense, that the military were in danger of being killed, and that's why they killed people. So once you enter into a separatist lane, it is difficult for you to get to political concessions. So most of the people who support Ambazonia as an indirect path to federation are making a strategic mistake.
Right? Why do you say that?
The thing that they would force a dialogue on the issues. If the West Cameroonians were saying that we want a return to federation by a vast majority, if that is what we are arguing for,
the West Cameroon
we will get support from international community. The international community will support us.
So who will be leading that sort of?
This is the problem. I have been advising Frundi to take up that course as the SDF party and say this is the solution. To take it up actively, you need political forces. You need credible elites. I've tried to work with Dr. Munzo, who was part of the AAC 1 and 2.
Yes.
And I blame the AAC 2 to have introduced this alternative, give us federation or total separation. That's where the mistake of West Cameroon began, because there you open up yourself to oppression. The people will say, okay, I'm not going to give you federation, then I want to wait for you to try to separate. When you enter the separation, I will have full justification before the international community to fight you. No country can support a separatist fight directly.
But people
we know that Sudan and Eritrea has gotten support from USA and Israel. These are for completely different reasons. The support. That was for other affairs.
But I think the argument that the people that are supporting separatism will say, why, if it's happened in Sudan, it happened in Eritrea, why can it not happen in Cameroon?
They have to look at how it happened in Sudan and Eritrea. So in Eritrea, it's about 20 to 30 years of fighting. Mm-hmm. So I'm asking them, are you ready to do that? Are you ready to do that? And they wanted to do that, keeping their children at home.
Well, if the answer is yes.
If their answer is yes. Then you look at South Sudan, they did that after 20 years and about 2 million people dead. So the question is, are you ready also to make these sacrifices? The answer is yes, but there is a problem. The problem is that after separation, these two countries have proven to be a disaster. And therefore, the world, which usually learns from this kind of things, is going to be less likely to create another Eritrea or South Sudan in Africa.
Okay.
So the success of South Sudan and Eritrea is actually an argument against Ambazonia.
Okay.
Because the people have not attained that peace and freedom that they were seeking, even after breaking away from the supposed oppressor. The oppressor now is within, and the divisions that you have created. In South Sudan, the idea is that the factions normally come out of this thing, and you cannot quench them. If you institute anarchy in a system, that anarchy does not go away after you have attained what you think is your goal. So that is why people have blamed me from advocating for a government-led process, political processes in order to bring peace. But that's the only way you can bring order into society. You have to go through constitutional methods and political methods in order to find a lasting solution. So the success of Eritrea and South Sudan is actually the reason why they cannot succeed. And let me remind the people of Ambazonia that Casamance in Senegal has been fighting on and off for about 38 years. They started just when President Biya came to power. They are not closer to having that independence. So it's not always true.
Gambia from Senegal is a good example as well, Prof, is it not?
Well, there you have different forces at play, different forces and different history at play that you can evoke. And you can add to that also the issue of Casamance. But what you ought to see there is the example that Ambazonia. What is the argument of Ambazonia?
Well, the argument
they refute the fact that they should not have been given independence by joining as an option in 1961. But the fact is that the Pan-Africanists.
Yes, Prof. I was just going to go. On that question, Ambazonia are saying there's never existed any treaty to formally bring the two countries together, as they say. What do you say to that?
They start by acknowledging the existence of the UN, which was a colonial system. So they over-elevate the UN in their affairs. They forget to see that the UN is a pragmatic thing that was set up by the colonial masters in order to deal with issues. But the question of a union treaty makes no sense. First, we were divided without the opinion of the people. Just after we lost the war, our fathers fought to defend German interest in Cameroon. Then they divided the country without our opinion. So our forefathers, the reunification and independent fathers, said, you do not ask our opinion, and therefore just put the country together without asking our opinion as well. So that was one option. Ambazonians ought not to forget that possibility. Now, the idea, then when you come into the independence and union treaty, the union treaty can be a de facto situation, which is recognized that on the 30th of September, the British forces, the British administration in British Southern Cameroon left. And then the federal constitution, which had been drafted in that summer, came into effect. And the fact that Fonche, who was the leader, de facto leader of Southern Cameroons, became the Prime Minister of West Cameroon and became the Vice President of the Republic, of the Federal Republic of Cameroon. That is more than any piece of paper can demonstrate.
So, in your opinion, Prof, we'll just conclude on this one. In your opinion, do you think a federated Cameroon, or going back to the constitution, the federal constitution as it was, that would be a solution?
I think the solution is no doubt a federation, and that federation ought to be protected more than that first federation. Okay. I am advocating for two-level constitution. The state should have a constitution, then the federal government, there should be a federal constitution. That would prevent anybody from manipulating the constitution at any time, because the elimination of the federation was against the constitution. That's the strongest argument we have.
Thank you.
It was illegal. The referendum was illegal. We cannot legally question the reunification vote of 11 February 1961, but we can legally question with success of the referendum of 1972 and demonstrate a mechanism that was in place in order to suppress West Cameroon because of the oil that had been found in that place. So a federation is a solution. But again, I would caution that while I'm for a two-state federation, I'm also open to a 10-state federation for two reasons. One is to preempt the attempts of the government to use the Northwest and the Southwest to resist the return to the federation. And secondly is to copy from Nigeria, where the federation at the beginning was a lopsided northern Nigeria, which dominated the east and the west, and that immediately led to the coup d'etat and led to the civil war. And one of the ways the civil war started because then Yakubu Gowon did the right thing to split up the lopsided federation into smaller federal states. And starting out with 3 federal regions, we now have a Nigeria that has about 36 federated states. So it is possible to return to a federation, which is either a 2-state federation or a 10-state federation, for instance, but still recognizing that the institution and the culture that exist in this state should be regulated by the state themselves. Once you give them the power in that constitution, for example, let's have a federal constitution that says all powers belong to the state except those powers that have been given to the federal government. Then you can solve many of the problems that Cameroon is facing today.
Professor Ben Akit, it was wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much for your time and your insight as well for contributing on this very important discussion. I think there will be much more opportunity, if that's grammatically correct. Yeah, but there will be other opportunities that we can we'll have this, continue to have this conversation, and I know your doors are open for to come in, and we continue to inform and educate, of course, the population and our listeners. We are off on 87.9 FM in Glasgow and Renfrewshire. Thank you so much. We've been talking on Cameroon, if Cameroon is in denial of its own history. We've been talking to Cameroonian Professor Ben Aki, who is based in the United States of America. I have to just state again that we invited 6 other people to join the discussion so that they can talk from their own perspectives, and we didn't get any response to that. But we want to thank you so much, Professor, for coming on and talking and giving your point of view. And we're also giving suggestions, and I hope Cameroonians will pick up on that as well. So thank you very much, Prof. I hope you've had a good time with us as well.
Thank you for a very rich discussion, and thank you for inviting me. I think this is the best way to contribute to what is happening in Cameroon, rather than just trying to support the two sides, which are actually the problem that the Cameroonians need to overcome: the government of Mr. Biya, and also the separatism, which actually props up the government of Mr. Biya. Freedom would come from people expressing views about the history of the country, and a more pragmatic way forward that keeps the country united. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. You have a nice day, sir.